Pádraig. If you haven't listened to it, go back and listen to it. He wrote a book called This Day in Irish History. And it's a fascinating book, really accessible to people of any ages. But it's just, I don't know, I kind of discussed it with him of how he managed to fit so much information into such small spaces. And it fills so much, and you could fly through and read it all in like a few sittings, or you can dip in and out as a coffee table book. So, Pádraig, thanks very much. And we got to talk a little about his time in Vancouver and stuff like that, which is apparently when he goes to work, he sees superhero things being filmed. So if you're into that, go to Vancouver. But thanks for your support during the week, as always, for all the stuff we put up. And we're going to get into this week's episode. A tough introduction, because this man seems to have done a bit of everything, but he has done podcasting, Motherfoclóír, the very popular Motherfoclóír. He's also the author of Motherfoclóír and Crack Baby, and he's also the man behind at the Irish 4 on Twitter. Darach O'Shea, how are you doing, Darach?
I'm doing wonderful. Thanks a million for having me, Darach.
Thank you very much for coming on. Petrified of the Irish language, and we are going to talk about why. And to a man who's very, very passionate about it. And I think this has been something that's, I wouldn't say it's been kind of, I haven't been nervous leading up to it, but I've certainly been a little bit worried about my fear of just reading things wrong. And like, even as far as your name, even though your name isn't, it looks more complicated than it is, you know?
That's the thing. There's always an element of anticlimax when people find out how it's pronounced.
Yeah, well, do you know that's another thing, and we will get into it, because silent letters and stuff in the Irish language is to me, it's, I don't know, all these things were kind of new as I was reading your book, so we'll get into it. But we'll start, Darach, with a short history of your upbringing, please.
Yeah, sure. So I grew up in Rathfarnham in South County Dublin, and a kind of sort of normal suburban house and yeah, then during the 80s and 90s. So I was a middle child and ended up marrying a middle child. I'm not sure if there's a significance there. There probably is. I think both have a overdeveloped sense of unfairness, I think.
Okay, yeah.
Which I think often happens. So yeah, I think that I went to a local school, which is a primary school called St. Mary's, where I met a lot of people. And then I went to a very different secondary school, which is called Gonzaga in Ranelagh, which was a kind of a rugby school, and had a very different sort of environment. I didn't know anyone else going in, whereas I felt everyone else seemed to know people. And I remember around that time, that's when I had always thought I was good at Irish in primary school, and then I found that it was a very kind of academically competitive, high pressure environment. And suddenly I felt like I started getting a very strong sense in there of not being good at anything, including Irish. And and that was probably not a great thing. And that's probably, but then I suppose I somehow survived secondary school. I wouldn't say unscathed, but somewhat scathed. And then I went to UCD. I think, like a lot of people, when I finished my Leaving Cert, I thought I'll never need to speak Irish again. And I did English and History of Art in university. And yeah, and then I went from there. And then I suppose I came back to Irish later in life when I wanted to know why it mattered so much to my dad. And also, I suppose, and yeah, during my 20s, I found when I had girlfriends and friends from other countries and mates from other countries, they'd always ask about Irish language. It's one of the first things they asked about Ireland. The same way when people meet Italians, or French people, when people meet Germans, they ask about the military service that you do when you're in your 20s, or when people meet Italians, they ask about cooking and things, and maybe military service too. And when people, it's one of the first things people ask Irish people when they're abroad is about the Irish language.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear you speak about going back to the Irish language, because I think a lot of people have that idea. It's a nice idea that we all have, that to think that we will do it, but we eventually think it's kind of a lot of hard work. So it's kind of, you went and did it.
Well, I think it is. I mean, there's the elements of hard work, and I think it does come down to what a person's goals are. And I know when I was thinking recently about how a lot of people actually understate. People will tell you they haven't got a word of Irish, and they say, "Well, what about Banya? You know what Banya is?" I go, "Yeah, okay, I have one word." And you know what Madra is, and suddenly you realize, okay, maybe you have 10 words. That's 10 more than you said a minute ago, and then maybe you actually realize you recognize 100 words that when you see them. And then you actually realize you recall more than you do. And people often say, I came out of school with perfect French. and I have no Irish. And I was like, really? So you read Le Monde, regularly on the website. You can name one French politician who isn't Emmanuel Macron, and then you find actually, people oversell their ability to speak French and German and fairly dramatically, and they seriously undersell their ability to speak Irish. So I'd say, it might be better than you think. The first thing that people actually do go back is they're surprised how much they remember.
Yeah, that's fair. And I actually, knowing this interview has been coming up and speaking to people about your books that I've been reading, it's been really fun to kind of hear that conversation back and forth about people who are quietly confident that they would be able to have a conversation, and then others who would just probably a bit more like me, But obviously we'll get into that. But Darach, when did you first become aware of mental health?
It's a good question, because I think when I was small, no one ever talked about mental health as the phrase in the 80s. It was just, it wasn't a phrase that was used. Even in the 90s, I remember that when we were watching the Rose Tree as a family, when the American Roses came on, almost half of them, if not more, would be saying they're studying psychology, and people would, my aunts and uncles and cousins, oh, psychology, as if it was the most American thing you'd ever heard in your life. It was a big punchline. And then I suppose I became slightly, in my teenage years, I started becoming aware of, without using the phrase, I became aware of the idea that a huge amount of pressure in school, leaving cert pressure, and also the various social pressures, particularly the pressure on young men to, have as much sex as possible, and lose your virginity as early as possible. These things, I never had an umbrella term that all these various pressures were actually physically having an impact on me and on my friends, but I started becoming very aware of it without actually using that phrase. And then in sixth year, the leaving cert year, a friend of mine attempted suicide, and then we had a actual talk. Our headmaster just had a talk with the whole year about what this meant, and I think even then there was a sense, the idea that what we were internalizing, no one ever thought maybe the amount of pressure that we're putting on ourselves isn't a thing. It was kind of a sense that who is responsible for, making Johnny feel this way, and those kinds of things. They still couldn't get to the point. And I remember thinking, but maybe we should all talk about how close lots of us have felt to that, and the various things that contributed to that, and made ways of pulling ourselves back from that, other than drinking.
Yeah.
And other than toxic masculinity, and other than saying it'll be worth it when you get this many points in the leaving. Yeah,
it's interesting actually that you say about people may have come close to taking their own lives, and it's I'm sure the figures are so much higher than maybe we believe or that are out there, because there's still probably some people who wouldn't want to speak about it in maybe feel shameful about it or see it as a weakness or something. And I think, having these conversations with different, and I'd say this in the podcast a lot because it's a question that I always ask, and having the different viewpoints from the different, age demographics and things like that is fascinating to me to hear, the different ways that people heard about it. And, these things have to be constantly discussed and brought up, and hopefully they will be, and we'll carry on doing it. What made you want to set up the podcast in the first place?
Well, I think the podcast I'd always enjoyed podcasts. In particular, I found that the possibilities of podcasting as a medium were so free. I mean, you'd listen to radio, and a lot of, even when you had good radio interviews, you'd find it'd be nice if they spoke for a little bit longer, or they didn't have ad breaks. And then when I started listening to all the big podcasts that everyone knows, like This American Life and things like that, I remember thinking this would do very well. And then when I discovered kind of the Irish podcasting scene, like shows like Juvenalia and some of Tony Rose stuff on the Tortoise Shack as well, I remember being really impressed and thinking it wasn't completely out of my reach. The American podcasts, they've got like 20 producers, and they've got a lot of high production values and incredible resources, and then you realize actually there are people who just go out and do it. And then so when I was and after I'd been a guest on Juvenalia, I was talking to them about how Alan McGuire made his show, and he was talking about how they booked up a number of guests, and they talked about them. He had a very simple classic concept, and I'm thinking I wouldn't mind doing a show like that for myself. One of my instincts was that I the Irish Four had been going for a couple of years. And at this point, I knew my book was going to be coming out. I actually announced the Motherfoclóír being published on the Juvenile podcast. And I thought, it would be cool to maybe do 5 or 6 episodes, bit of laugh. And I was really anxious about being interviewed on television to promote the book, or being interviewed on the radio. And then I thought, recording a podcast might be a bit of media experience.
Yeah.
And then so I thought, so that was part of my motivation. And I had a couple of ideas. And I thought also that, the Irish Four, I was conscious that the Irish Four had gotten very popular. It had actually gotten more popular than some official Irish language institution accounts. And I felt at that point, like on one level, I didn't really see it as a success. I saw it as being like, I felt like, what's that guy again? Gary Newman, having two fingers on a keyboard and making more money than a guy who kind of was a lead pianist with the London Philharmonic or something like that. And so I felt like this is, I have the opportunity to take the Irish Four's brand and audience and introduce them to people who actually know a lot more than me about Irish. And I found, so some people I've been in touch with were like Garrity McAvoy, who was doing a PhD at the time in legal issues related to minority languages, including sign language and Irish, and had taught Irish and studied Irish law. Pedro Kavonik, who is the co-founder of Papa Gaeltacht, and who had also studied Irish at a postgraduate level. And Emer Duffy, who I've become friendly with, who had given me some advice in the old Irish stuff in Motherfoclóír, and who was also had done a thesis in that area. So I thought between old Irish and legal issues and some of the Irish literature issues, I felt that we had a pretty good team. Olama Jackadumini as well helped out, and Shuni Gwen with some of the early episodes. And I felt that I had a pretty good opportunity to have a high standard of discussion about Irish language issues that I haven't thought about, because when you've got like a very good quality program on Radio na Gaeltacht discussing, and you have outstanding journalism, even like now they've found Irish-speaking Ukrainians discussing the issue over there, and Irish-speaking Russians discussing those kinds of issues. And whenever there's actually a global issue, they do actually find someone like in Palestine who speaks Irish, and they get experts from a very high standard of conversation. But for people who don't speak Irish, what you don't get, people say, is, what's the deal with the letter V? Is it in the language or not? And those kinds of things. I felt that while some of those things are a little bit silly, they actually do, they create a nice little opening where you can discuss a range of issues. And that's something I wanted to do.
Yeah, and because we often talk about it, and I often think back to school and learning Irish, and it being, I know school isn't supposed to be fun kind of an idea, but I remember the Irish language or the Irish classes, I should say, would be quite daunting for me in particular. And when something is like that, when you're terrified, and I still am like that when I see Irish written down on a page, I'm still quite, I don't know, it's like there's like a PTSD that's over the top, but you know what I mean? The kind of, there's an anxiety behind and it takes you back. And there's not, you don't walk around seeing equations on paper, and so you're not going to get panicked by that. So I see it with Irish. So when I was listening to the podcast, you had yourself and all the people you had on, and all the other hosts on it. Fascinating interviews, but in a fun way, in a way that people can kind of get involved with and kind of like laugh along with, but also learn. And I think it's the same with your books as well. There's a fun and funniness that runs through it amongst all the kind of educational stuff. And I guess the question was going to be, why do you think it was so popular? And I hope I didn't just answer the question for you.
I mean, I think I'm very grateful it was as popular as it was, and I'm grateful that it got to that stage. I think for me, like I felt that I mean, I was lucky that there was actual growing interest in the Irish language, but also a lot of the positions, like where in the noughties, you'd have a lot of opinion pieces, largely unchallenged, about how everyone hates Irish, how everyone hates Peg, how Gael schools are elitist and borderline racist, and all these things. People, and well, these will either go unchallenged or they'll be over challenged by individuals who maybe didn't maybe read the room. And whereas I felt that maybe most people actually, a lot of people don't hate Irish. Maybe people wish they spoke more, but the actual amount of people who hate Irish is quite small. When you poke them, you realize there's often another issue there, which gets it. And I found that but the big thing was there was an opening in the market for the books and the podcast, in that there wasn't really like an English language format for discussing the Irish language. And while I think yes, I mean it seems hypocritical or weird or wrong to discuss Irish and English, but if you don't, you give the other guys you surrender unconditionally to the people who don't like Irish at all.
Yeah.
And when you actually said, well, here's a place, and if someone's like listening to this on the train at 5:10, and they think, or they hear Sharon O'Ville on the radio saying something about how Irish is fun, and they think, oh my God, maybe I should go back to Irish. I mean, you're not going to switch straight over to writing the Celtic Dark, but you might switch over to Motherfoclóír, or maybe you will eventually arrive at writing other than writing Litha, and reading notes and all those things. And so there was definitely a place for a staging table, and there was definitely a space for challenging those kind of daddish, think pieces about how Irish was. And because I think we were just very lucky that that space was empty when we arrived.
Yeah, absolutely. And there has to be an awkward question. But like, do you have like a couple of episodes that you look back, not necessarily your favorite guests, but a couple of episodes that you're most proud of?
Yeah, there's a few episodes that I'm particularly proud of. I think when early on, maybe it wasn't production wise, it wasn't great, but when Garagine told me she wanted to do an episode talking about her experience with learning Irish with dyslexia. I found that when we were doing that, I realized that rather than just being media training practice, for me, this podcast had the potential to be something very special. That was definitely that was a moment when I realized that. And I think when we had an episode about PEG, where we had a number of listeners kind of include their own thoughts in a montage at the end, I felt that was a very powerful, tasteful ending, and really glad of how that one turned out. And I think also I felt that like having Sinead Burke on was really wonderful as well. She was a particularly special guest. We had a really good run of guests there during the pandemic, where we had a few episodes which I thought just were in a row, which did very, very well. But I think an episode we got a lot of talk back from, which a very positive response from, was the one called Hot Gale Summer, where we actually took some of the critical articles about Irish we put them in a context, which was that they were silly season paper filler articles. We just very mostly calmly, not entirely, but mostly calmly dissected what they're actually saying and made some points, and we got a huge response from people from that. It was kind of so I was proud of how the reaction was there. But I think for me, it was the episode about dyslexia, also the episode was with Garagine about sign language, and I felt that like a lot of people, I learned so much, and I probably, there are points of it where Garagine and Caroline were chatting away where I was just picking my jaw up, because I didn't know so many of these things, and I have ISL using colleagues now, and just even be able to know those points and be able to start those conversations with them, it has been fantastic. I was grateful to be part of that.
There was many episodes which I really loved, and the ISL one, I'm glad you mentioned that, because it was fascinating one. There was the last episode, I think, was really really interesting, and I found it quite, like, at the end I found it quite touching because of what the amount of episodes you'd put out first of all, but the amount of information that you'd given to people and talking about that, and you could tell by it was just the three on for that one. And you could tell by how close you were and how well you got on and stuff like that. And I can think of, like, I'm sure this, the podcasts, or I'm not sure, maybe, I hope you're sure, but if the podcast could have gone on, or was it like, had it reached the point then where it was just busyness and lives had kind of taken over a bit?
Yeah, it was. I think that there was a space for the podcast to go. I think on one level, when we we all had fairly big career events last year, including our producer and our artist Kirsten, but also Patter is now mayor of Séaghdha County Council, and then Garagine was in the process of finishing her thesis and applying for postdoctoral work, and I was moving on to a different position of work as well. But I mean, even then in the group chat, we'd still say, "Oh, this thing that's happening right now would make a great episode," and yeah, there's people turning up and so there's always things, but at some point, I think it's okay to say that these things may not always last forever. I had a few episode ideas which I really wanted to do, which we didn't ever get around to. Wanted to do an episode on the Cranberries, an episode on Seamus Heaney, an episode on U2, which we never got around to doing. But at the same time, I mean, I suppose if we did those, there would have been 3 or more episodes which I would have thought of doing at that point, which never would have happened. So it's a it's I think the podcast scene has changed a lot. And even when I was talking to Blind Boy in one of the last episodes, and it was really interesting to get his perspective on the podcast scene in Ireland, because obviously he's done so very well. And he was saying, if he was starting now, he probably wouldn't be able to get a foot in. It would not have made the splash it made at the time, because it's become so crowded, particularly crowded with people who are already established in their field.
Yeah. The great thing about it as well, about the podcast, is that they're all still out there for people to listen to. So people, if you haven't heard it, definitely go back and listen to the podcast, because it's absolutely fascinating. I'm just going to read out an ad, Darach, and no you have a drop of wine there and relax yourself. Okay, so Fusion Training Center, Monksland Athlone, a place to train in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, kickboxing, martial arts, and CrossFit. A great atmosphere with experienced coaches and a real sense of community. If you want to join the team, find us on Facebook at Fusion Training Center or drop in for a chat. Fusion Training Center, train like a warrior. I haven't said this in a while, but I'm 112 episodes in now, and I still don't know it off by heart. And I get in about 20 words in, and then I'll slip up. So I have to always bring out the copybook just in case, Exactly. So Motherfoclóír. Sorry, I nearly said the bad word there. Motherfoclóír. I do it every time. Motherfoclóír. So it's called Motherfoclóír. Dispatches from a not so dead language.
Yeah.
And why did you feel that was the correct title for it?
Well, initially, I suppose to get back to the start, I suppose I'll talk about a bit how the book kind of began to happen. And I was, first of all, I suppose a few people had said when the Irish War was kicking off, there was a few articles about it, and I'd been invited to write a little bit about it and things. There's radio features on it, and people said you could probably get a book out of this. And I thought, well, maybe I could. Or maybe people could, buy an Irish dictionary. They're all pretty good. And then someone else said, someone else could use your translations, and you don't own the Irish language, no one can stop you. And thought, well, God, yeah, maybe I better get onto it. But so an agent did approach me who funnily enough, after Lisa McInerney had tweeted about how much she enjoyed the Irish for. An agent had basically kind of started following me and got in touch and asked, if I thought about doing a book based on it. And then when initially, and I had already received correspondence from some publishers, and I think they were like, we can just print out all your tweets, in a book, that we'll keep production costs low by printing in real crappy paper and put a pint and a shamrock on the front and have, the Irish for have it as a sell up in Carol's or wherever else. And I mean, no offense to Carol's, yes, offense, no offense. But I thought when I explained to Sally Ann why what the motivation behind the account was, and there was a family story there, she said, that's definitely something we think people would like to hear about. And then, after that, when she submitted it, I had written a kind of an introductory sort of 50 pages or so based on, the spec of what the book would look like and while I was getting back to writing. And then I met a few publishers, and they were saying, okay, we like this, or we think, this would be good. We're just going to call it maybe the Irish for, or we call it, and Darach O'Shea's introduction to the Irish language or something. And I was like, I want to underline how it's personal and how it's reverent, and how also I'm not pretending to be a world expert. I'm trying to basically say, yes, that this is something that's, I may have been a little bit influenced by Freakonomics.
Okay.
but yeah, so I thought that Motherfoclóír was funny, and some of them said, we don't like that. We think you could call it something else. Maybe something like Smuggle a Roan or something, even, like a jellyfish. And I was like, I mean, I prefer to use the name. And then initially it was going to be Your Motherfoclóír Dispatches from the Irish Four. When eventually we found Hella Zeus, who are an independent publisher in Britain, with an Irish editor called Neil Belton, who was very respected in the industry. My agent and my publisher are both Irish people living in London. So even though it was published in Britain, it was very much published by an Irish team.
Yeah.
And Neil was like, I love the title. It's fantastic. Let's go with that. And then, and then he actually, what really impressed me was like, I love this writing. This is fantastic. And you say he has a popular Twitter account as well. I was like, it never even occurred to me, because I had been rejected so many times for radio plays and things like this, and novel fairs and stuff like that. That the idea that I could just send something to a publisher and they just love it. There have been so many gatekeepers, and social media did open a door which hadn't been there before. But then we talked about Dispatches from the Irish Four, and then as they're happy with the name, and we go during the production process, they're saying, we don't need to pin this so closely to the Twitter account. The book stands. It doesn't need to be, and the further it gets from Twitter, the better. I think Neil Price, I don't think Neil even knows or they like how big and all pervasive social media is, and it's probably better for him to be away from it.
Yeah.
But so he's like, how about Dispatches from a Not Quite Dead Language? And I was like, I don't like that. And I do. And I go, would you settle for not so dead? And I thought that was a little bit cheeky, whereas Not Quite Dead, just there was I didn't like the idea of dead language being there at all. So not so was thing. And some people didn't like the phrase not so dead either, but there was a process at the end. The people who didn't like it didn't realize how hard I fought to make it exist. But yeah, so when you, generally speaking, most people they get this, when they get a shot at publishing, you generally roll over. And so fighting back, I mean, if most people don't love their title so much that they wouldn't see a book published, but I fought a little bit, and I felt that not so dead language was a decent compromise.
Absolutely. I think I love the title of it. You started the book with Irish names, a list of Irish names and their meaning, and obviously I knew some of the names, not so much the meanings of the names, but it pulled me in because obviously we could relate to names. We hear names every day. A lot of those names we hear every day. But as the book opened out, then there was the introduction of things like silent letters, and like you said, the letters that are in the English language and not in the Irish language, and all these kind of things, which like the fada, the pronunciation and things like that. Some things I had forgotten about. The fada thing, I guess, was probably one of them, but the silent letters and the Irish names and all of a sudden this kind of beauty within this language, which I had disregarded, like because of, like we spoke about already, the idea of Irish just being hard workers in school and didn't want to do it. It became, like I said, the book, there's funniness and stuff throughout the book, but I think you've introduced the kind of beauty of the Irish language to me, and I hope that was kind of part of what you wanted to do, at least.
It was, and I was hoping that I could just, if we step back from, I suppose, some of the particulars of learning, and I wasn't exactly necessarily trying to teach things. I wanted to say, if you look at it from this perspective, this thing might fall into place. And because I think like a lot of, like, I remember in school, like when things like the dentals rule and stuff are useful and they're good to know. But like we weren't told them. If I remember thinking, if a teacher just sat down and explained these things to me instead of just having this kind of bouts of repetition in the class, or just having a total immersive environment. Some people just need things to be explained to them for 2 minutes, and that's why I went. So in that sense, I thought taking a few different angles and unpredictable angles to explain why something Irish goes this way was a worthwhile project. And for me, Irish names are most people on the planet, their only experience of the Irish language is an Irish name. So I felt that was a good introduction.
Absolutely. And so you talk. There's a thread with your father throughout the book. Just for people who may not have read the book, what was the connection there between your dad and the Irish language?
Yeah, so my dad was from Kinmare and Kerry, and he was a multilingual man. He spoke many languages, and he was very interested in languages all his life. Even in his 80s, when he died, he was actually trying to teach himself Cantonese after maybe speaking. Yeah, and he had kind of conversational Arabic, a bit of Japanese, as well as teaching Irish and French and Spanish in an Irish language school, and having kind of lived in France for a while, and learned all these other languages as well as the Latin, speaking to everyone. So and for a guy who knew all these languages, I was wondering, why did Irish mean the most to him? And if you knew as many as these, you probably would have a favorite. And it was interesting that it was this one. And then I suppose, it became a kind of a conversation starter at that point when I realized we only had so many conversations left. And as Irishmen being what we are, we don't talk a lot. We couldn't just talk directly about our feelings or anything like that. But we could talk possibly about Irish words.
That is, yeah. I like. It's beautiful that Irish was his favorite language, and I've had a couple of guests on who were obviously speak Irish fluently, and they described the idea of it as being quite grounding. It felt that they were grounded to the land that they were on. Does that make sense to you?
It does, and I know some people have that experience, and if their experience of the Irish language is something that's connected to nature or farming words or landscape words, and it wasn't quite like that for me. Then it wasn't a case that I was cutting turf and that my dad was shouting at me that there was a word for the turf water and a different word for the dry turf to the wet turf. And that was not my experience in Rathfarnham. But I mean, the experience probably did come from being teased about having an unusually spelt Irish name and those kinds of things, and the weird kind of tribal nature of the Dublin school system and the very subtle and strange layers of the class system in Dublin, and how that there's different types of people are constantly giving very small class indicators, and you don't even realize what you're showing or what you're hiding all the time. And which is highly stressful, and probably not good for anyone.
No, absolutely not. Yeah.
But it's weird that Irish names have somehow found themselves into this mix of the Dublin class system, that some people think, oh, this means you're very middle class, and some people think, no, it means you're not middle class at all. It was a funny one because in Gonzaga, if you had an all Irish name, it meant yes, that maybe your parents were teachers or civil servants or possibly a creative barrister. But whereas people whose names were on the company directors and stuff tended not to have Irish language names.
Yeah, it's interesting. That has been a huge thing where, as a joke, you will hear a lot of people say in a particular we'll say area of Dublin, where they might say the accent of the Irish name that goes along with it.
Here comes little Faulkner or something.
That kind of stuff. It's interesting how it's shifted in those terms. But in the second book, then Crack Baby, there's a slight change, or maybe a sense of more optimism more in the title of Dispatches from a Rising Language. And between writing the two books, was that something that you did see, or was that always on your mind that there was a difference between the two?
I think I wanted when I was writing Crack Baby, it was at an early stage of I was coming off the high of Motherfoclóír doing so well, and that was that the context was successful enough to have another crack at it, and I suppose it was looking forward to where Irish language is going and what was happening next, and I suppose, and in that sense, I was wondering where I was trying to put a positive spin, and I was conscious also that I never really wanted to have dead language in the title of the previous one, so it was a little correction to that, and I think so. I felt like I was very happy with parts of Crack Baby. I think maybe when you do a debut novel or a debut album, there's a certain completeness as possible that isn't always possible in a second. And I think this is why people often like debut novels and debut albums more than the later ones, even if the later ones have better bits, because you actually get you can get a stronger sense of a start, middle, and end. Whereas I think I probably I felt that the good bits of Crack Baby were better than the good bits of Motherfoclóír, but possibly Motherfoclóír gel better as a book.
Okay. I finished Crack Baby the day before yesterday, and what I kind of see what you're saying, but at the same time, there was I love the fact that your daughter was a a talking point within, more than a talking point within the book, and your idea of maybe looking to the future, that came up quite a lot in it. Can you actually, would you mind pronouncing your daughter's name?
Yeah, my daughter's name is Lasarina, and
it looks more it looks more complicated to me than it sounds. Now, you spelled it out phonetically, so I could get it, but it's such a beautiful name that I hadn't heard before, and I loved. I don't know whether I'm sure it was just the way that you're able to express yourself very well when it came to your daughter, and when at the start of the book and at the end of the book when you spoke about her, and about communicating. That was a big thing when you communicate with a child, and I guess that's a huge part for you now, approaching as Lasarina grows older. It's the English language and the Irish language is going to be a massive thing for her and for you. And is that something that kind of, like, I suppose, how big is that a thing for you, for Lasarina to be native speaker?
Well, for me, the big thing, I suppose, because Lasarina has Down syndrome, and because language is always going to be a struggle for her. I mean, most important thing for me is that she's able to communicate. I would like her to know that the Irish language is available to her, and it's a place that will be welcome to her. But the priority is that she's actually just able to express herself. And I think possibly in the process of dealing with the shock of finding out that your child has a profound disability like Down syndrome, is that you deal with it in different ways. You, first of all, you enter the stage of denial, and then you enter a unhelpful but necessary and strange stage where you think, well, maybe my child will be an exception. Instead of actually accepting what the disability is, you think, well, yes, my child has this disability, but maybe they'll be exceptional and not like what the normal is, for what the normal situation is for a person with this. And that's not actually, and while that's all very, all children are exceptional and capable of great things, it's still not. You still haven't reached the acceptance stage of that. And I think it's true that we've been really lucky with Lasarina's health, and unless she hasn't had the health issues that a lot of people and a lot of children with a trisomy 21 have. But I mean, I suppose we'd still be at a stage where her communication is such that maybe that bilingualism isn't a priority compared to getting there. It's it's been a hard journey getting to that point, but ultimately all that matters is what's right for her. And I hope that, I mean, that she will be in mainstream school long enough to actually have some Irish and enjoy it and find it to be something to be interesting. But it's I'm not going to try and make a point to the world by showing everyone, oh, look, if she can do it, anyone else can, or something like that. So that's the thing. I mean, I think it's she's in a mainstream school, which is fantastic. And she's got friends in class, and she's friends in the area, and she loves going to school. So these things are great, and I don't take any of it for granted. But I suppose I think possibly, yes, if I waited a year before I wrote Crack Baby and started writing straight after, when she was still so young, when a lot of these things were new to me, I think it may have been a better resource if I'd known more about how that life experience was going to be.
Yeah. I just found it very touching the way you wrote about it. About, you spoke about finding out and yourself and your partner, but at the end of the book, it was kind of like you come through, and I kind of suppose I'd have to see this from where I see it as a reader, of how you'd come through something the way you did. And obviously your experiences are something completely different than what you're talking about, but you were still able to put them across to someone who hasn't experienced, I don't have children or anything like that. I haven't experienced anything like that. So, not only were you pointing stuff out in the Irish language. You're pointing stuff out in a journey as a a father. Someone has found out they're going to be a father, and then someone has become a father. And those kind of personal touches within the book, you can talk about the Irish language. You can talk about having fun and stuff, but the personal touches in both books are really touching as well to someone, to a reader. So that's just another part of why I love them so much.
Thank you. I appreciate you saying that. It was I think, because it is general, like the return to Irish is it's personal. It's a you're taking risk, or you risk of making an ass of yourself, and you're returning to these kind of weird childhood memories, and you're and entering a world where maybe both people are very comfortable, you're not. So it is, I think it has to be a personal journey. It has to be told as a personal journey. That was my feeling on it anyway.
Absolutely, yeah. So you seem to be very interested in etymology in general, though. Would that be fair to say?
I think, I am interested in words in general,
Yeah.
and where they come from, and I suppose, I was interested in the English language of Ireland, and how much of that just comes from Irish, but also how much of it comes from just slightly different usage and little things, and particularly the slight regional differences. And I found this even from when I was a teenager in school, how different schools had slightly different slang words, things for things.
Yeah.
And then you'd find this in Irish college or with cousins that people use. And I remember always wondering where those boundaries were, where these actually new words stopped and began.
It was one your episode that you did with Blind Boy, and I know he's a big fan of etymology as well. Like, and he tends to speak about it quite a lot on his own show. And you kind of got into that kind of flow state that he talks about quite a lot, where you were just kind of going, and there was that's where I saw that you were into etymology in general. But you started talking about Flann OBrien, and you mentioned Flann OBrien before, and Flann OBrien has been a writer who I've heard, like, you hear about a lot about Flann OBrien.
Yeah.
But I've never read any of his books, shamefully. What is it about Flann OBrien that you like so much?
I think I got a copy of an anthology of his journalism when I was on holidays as a teenager, and I remember just being blown away at the fact that there's a sense of freedom, that he wasn't actually following any particular rules. He was just writing whatever the hell he wanted. And when I found that Swim Two Birds, after that, it was a sense that he just wrote whatever he wanted, and basically he had this total freedom, and it wasn't a case of books having starts, middles, and ends, or anything at all. It was just a sense that he just was letting his brain run loose and go to crazy places. And some of it was just like silly puns, and like large stories spinning into silly puns. Some of it was comedy, some of it was reviews, some of it was Irish mythology, and some of it was just scathing observational humor. And he just did so with his real sense of a sense of mischief. And I just found there was something I always aspired to.
Is it because in your description there, like, is it accessible? Is it, and when I say that, I suppose I'm kind of talking about someone like James Joyce, where everybody is overwhelmed by the way Joyce, writes. Is it more accessible than Joyce?
I would consider it more accessible than Joyce. Yes.
Okay.
Certainly, I would start if someone wanted to introduce an introduction to Miles na Gcopaleen or Flann OBrien. I would say yes. The best of Miles is a compilation of his Cruiskin Lawn articles for the Irish Times. That's extremely accessible and very funny, and that's where I'd start. And if you like that, you'll probably have a good shot at Swim Two Birds, which is a modernist book. So it is. It's a little challenging than you might find. Some people also find the Third Policeman to be a maybe more accessible way in as well.
Yeah, because again, it's just, when you keep hearing about something or someone, and you keep thinking, "Oh, I'm definitely going to read that," and you kind of push back, and I've continued and will continue to push back against Ulysses, because there isn't enough time in the world for that. But even though, look, I understand it's a classic, I get it, fair enough. But so what do you like to do in your spare time, Darach?
Well, I mean, I suppose, I don't have a huge amount of spare time with two small kids and a job and working on the third book. That's it generally everything gets scoffed up pretty quickly, I suppose. I mean, just what time I have left. I mean, I do like to snuggle up with my wife and a glass of wine and maybe watch some television. We watched best TV show I watched recently was Yellow Jackets. I thought that was outstanding.
I saw an ad for it, or maybe like when you're scrolling through your Sky and it's just got the little picture. Maybe it was the little picture. But I did hear a lot of good stuff about that one.
So I think it's something I've noticed more and more, and you'll notice that when you'll notice that when you when you hit your 40s is suddenly the stuff that was popular.
That's May, by the way. That's May. Just
okay. The stuff that was popular when you were a teenager, suddenly teenagers are into it in a flashback way. Because when I in the 90s, there was a huge 70s throwback. You had films like Carlito's Way and things like that, and like the soundtrack to Reservoir Dogs, Pulp Fiction was very 70s leaning, and you had like 70s fashions. You had Britpop was emulating Bowie and things like that, and Jamaica was copying Stevie Wonder, and you had and now you're getting a lot of this kind of 90s and early 90s throwback stuff, and Yellow Jackets it has a look back to a bunch of teenagers who are stranded in the Canadian Rockies during the 90s, and how the survivors are now looking back about that time. And so there's a lot of I suppose observational there's a lot of stuff. The recreation of the 90s parts is extremely accurate and rings very true. So I found that was very interesting. And I try not to watch too much television. I never watch television on my own. I only ever really watch it with herself. And then I try to read as much as I can, because what little time I have. So I listen to audiobooks, and I listen to a lot of audiobooks when I'm commuting, and I've read some very good graphic novels recently. I found that in terms of actually getting through a lot of reading, I found there's a Canadian writer called Walter Scott who's written a couple of he's the same name as a more famous writer, which is always dangerous. But he's written a series of books called The Wendy's Revenge and Wendy, Master of Art, which are about an art student in Montreal in Canada, and just how this crazy self-destructive art student who almost gets her life together and then pulls right back each book. And they're just outstanding. I just want to find someone else who's read them who I can talk to them about, because they're absolutely brilliant. So there's another book I read recently which is outstanding, is Tunnels by Ruth Modan, it's a graphic novel about the search for the lost ark, but it's set in modern day Israel and Palestine, and in that the political contexts of those countries right now. And so you think you're getting a great Indiana Jones story, which you're actually getting a kind of a satirical take on a very complex political situation, which is fantastic.
It's funny when I suppose it's kind of an older kind of an old-fashioned view of graphic novels is that they don't discuss the larger topics, and then you kind of find out through friends, I would say, that is definitely not the case. I know Mouse is a hugely popular graphic novel, but I realized quite quickly that I was really out of touch with that kind of thing.
There's some outstanding stuff, and particularly for people with busy lives who got themselves in a reading rush, and it's very easy to fall out of the habit of reading, and kind of hard to find your way back. I found that the possibility of finishing something in a single reading was quite enticing to me, and it did. And once you break that cycle, and you suddenly become an obsessive reader again, which is great. And I think it's where we all want to be.
Oh, absolutely. Can you tell us anything about your third book?
Well, yeah, so it's the third book has emerged from the ashes of, I had been writing a historical novel which collapsed on itself. I painted myself into a corner, which happens a lot in writing. And I have been working on a book about the story behind Raglan Road, the beloved song and poem by Paddy Kavanagh, which was not considered one of his best poems during his lifetime, but very much has been brought to the public imagination because of Luke Kelly's version of the song. And Kavanagh had written this about a young woman called Hilda Moriarty, who was a medical student in Dublin around the time that he was doing his rounds. Kavanagh had some very success with his first book, and then was floundering for a while doing film reviews and stuff. People always forget that Kavanagh was a film critic. He wanted to be a film director.
Oh, did he?
And well, yeah, he wanted. I mean, he says he's even promised these things, but and they had a friendship which kind of didn't really go where. But then she ended up marrying Don O'Malley, who went on to become the revolutionary minister of education, made secondary school free. And so I thought there was a story in this love triangle. Then when I was looking into it, I found that that O'Malley and Archbishop McQuaid kind of hated each other and were basically always at odds with each other. And meanwhile, Kavanagh had a strange court jester relationship with Archbishop McQuaid. And I thought this is an interesting, so you've got what was love triangle is now a hate quadrangle. And then what I found then as I was working on it, I thought that I didn't really want to write a redemption arc story about a female politician. I didn't want to basically, and Kavanagh was probably not I didn't want to do he treated people quite badly, and I felt that it's certainly his behavior was shabby. But I did find from the ruins of my research, I found some other incredible stories about the mid-century literacy in Ireland, and that's going to be the basis of my next book.
Brilliant. I'm looking forward to reading it. I have to ask you this because you did mention in one of your books that you liked films. It's just something I do. A couple of your favorite films off the top of your head?
Off the top of my head, my favorite film, I think, my favorite experience in the cinema was Back to the Future when I was a kid.
Really?
I think Back to the Future is an outstanding film, and even though yes, it's not perfect, I do love it very much. And I like big kind of 90s action films. I think Point Break is a masterpiece.
Very, very good, yeah.
And and if Roadhouse is ever on, I always watch it.
I've never seen Roadhouse, actually, surprisingly.
It's I think, but then I would also say now, I think I love the film Roman Holiday, which I remember thinking when I saw that, I remember thinking it's weird to think that film is so old, as that Audrey Hepburn's character was loosely based on Queen Elizabeth or whatever she was called back then. It was that far back.
Wow. And
I think the best screenplay and probably one of my favorite directors and Sally Agnew. I think When Harry Met Sally. I just think that there's there's just brilliant scene after brilliant scene, quotable line after quotable line, and just two amazing performances.
When Harry Met Sally came late to me, actually. I don't really know why, to be honest, but maybe it was about 5 years ago, so I was about 34, 35 when I watched it. And it was one of those ones where it's like, geez, it was a huge surprise to me just how good it was, because it's one of those films, it's iconic that some of the lines, the diner scene and stuff. But when I watched it, I was like, oh, you understand. And it's the same, like, people would have told me that don't go near Point Break.
Yeah.
They loved it, but they would have thought I wouldn't have liked it. And I probably avoided it for a good while. And then when I watched it, I was like, oh, that's a class film. And
it takes you by surprise, because it's there's every scene is there for a reason. It's like a Swiss watch of an action film. Every piece is working well. And also it does kind of contradict some of your expectations of how these kind of films normally go. It's I suppose that there's something from having a female director, possibly, is how some of those stories were handled differently than maybe if it had been made by one of those other big kind of 80s action, 90s action film directors.
Yeah, there's a more depth of emotion to it than you'd expect with this kind of buddy kind of, or all, well, not buddy, but all male kind of cast, I suppose, especially of the time.
That's the thing. I think when you have a specific female director and a mostly male cast, it's almost like she's looking at men as strange creatures, and it's almost like a kind of a Richard Attenborough documentary about men as a specific thing, and not as the normal way of being, which I think is quite interesting.
It is, and it's fascinating to see where Catherine Bigelow has gone afterwards, to see how big she has become, and some of the films, unbelievable films that she has made. Darach, where can people find you?
Well, so I'm on the Irish for on Twitter. I have a personal account, Darach OS, as well, which is I occasionally talk nonsense on. And yeah, so the podcast is still available if people want to find it. It's called Motherfoclóír, and it's wherever you get podcasts. And I occasionally write for the journal as well.
Thank you so much. I was really delighted when you said you'd come on, and I was so thrilled, like I said to you earlier, that I was able to fit both books in, and before I could get to chat to you, so I could get a fully rounded version. Darach, would you mind hanging around for just a minute? I'll close it out and we'll get a quick photo, and we'll be on our way. All right.
Definitely.
Thank you, Darach. I also want to thank the usual people, but I will always name them. John for his technical support, Nathan for the promotional side of things. It's showing a lot of benefits, and we thank him for that. I thank the people who helped me get here and do this. My mum, my dad, my granddad, Jaren Calvin. Subscribe to our YouTube channel if you would, or on Instagram and Facebook and Twitter, all those places. I know I say this every week. Spotify, Apple, Anchor, Google Podcasts. Still probably wouldn't even remember to say how this stuff but like as I say every week, thanks to everyone for tuning in. And Darach, once again, thank you so much.
My absolute pleasure. Thanks so much.
I loved it. Everybody else, as the name is in the title, see you next week. Take care of yourselves. Bye.